Good. So we'll have some time to ask questions as we go forward, but it's my turn. So I'd like to. Your name again? Yoga Maya. Okay, so you came from where?
I came from Peru. I live in Peru, but I Scotland originally.
México. La Ciudad de México. Distrito Federal.
Sí.
Sí.
Yeah, de México.
Conozco. Okay, so you came from Sweden. The phone call. Do we have a copy of Today we're gathered to discuss the occasion of commemorate the passing of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura from the world. We're fortunate to myself to be in touch with him through two of his very prominent disciples, Bhaktisiddhanta, Swami, Prabhupada, as you know, carried out Thakura's ambition for a worldwide campaign disseminating the benediction of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Maharaj, who was very close to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura, and in that regard, wrote a beautiful poem or song, one among many, glorification of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura. And it's a song that Swami Prabhupada at one time asked that it would be sung in all of his temples every day. For different reasons, that didn't happen. Nothing of any consequence, but it is nonetheless sung in most of the institutions that flowed from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura through his immediate disciples. And it's endearing to us because it illustrates how or to what extent it was considered or agreed upon by the disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur that Pujyapada Sridhar Maharaj was able to capture him in poetry. So again, they institute singing it in all of their temples, and in some of the temples, in some holy places, some verses from the poem have been engraved in stone and placed in a such a way that visitors will take notice. So we're going to sing it. Some some discussion. Now, I don't know, do we have, maybe we don't have enough of sheets for everybody to sing. So I think what I'll do is I'll sing the 3 lines, and then I'll sing the 4th line, and then you can all respond with the 4th line. Pranamami Sada Prabhupada. Any cartoons? Seva ki jai.
Padajugam Dugodhar Madurandar Patravaram Saradabhayadayak Puja Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Sajjana Sangapatim Patitadika Karunikaika Gatim Devanchita Vanchakat Chintyapadam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Tikoma Kanchana Dirgatam Tanunindita Hema Minaramadam Madanarudha Vandita Chandrapadam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Saraswati Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Pranamami Sada Prabhupada Padam Jai Prabhupada 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 Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur ki Tirobhava ki Jai. Oh, Bhaktisiddhanta ki Premanande. Give a brief antidote further about this song that I'm reminded of. When my Guru Maharaj first brought some of his disciples from North America back to India, he was hosted at Pujapachita Maharaj's Sri Chaitanya Saraswati Math, among other places. And on the occasion, I believe, of the celebration of the birth date or the appearance of Pujapachita Maharaj, they were attending there. And in the midst of the devotees, standing out was Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj, godbrother of Prabhupada and Srila Maharaj, who was famous for his kirtan. And he was singing the song, which Prabhupada was confusing, but my Guru Maharaj's disciples, hadn't heard. And at the end of the song, he began to chant Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, as we have just done. And the disciples of my Guru Maharaj hadn't heard that before either. So it wasn't a custom at that time to sing Jai Prabhupada, apparently in ISKCON. And so they asked Prabhupada if they could do that in glorification of him, whom they also affectionately and with reverence referred to as Prabhupada, and he gave us permission. So Jai Prabhupada began there, if you will, as it's known now around the world. Something that worth thinking about, considering. And along those lines, I remember another anecdote worth repeating. When Prabhupada arrived at one time in his temple in Buffalo, New York, which is up northern part of New York State. His assistant at the time was unpacking his bags, and in his bags he found a picture of Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta. So he pulled the picture out, and he wasn't sure where to put it. And so Prabhupada noticed his, and he said, "Yes, I have my Prabhupada too." And you can put it over there. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Prabhupada's ki jai. So today we're commemorating the passing of in the world of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. But in order to appreciate that, let's talk a little bit about the rest of his greater balance of his life in this world as we've come to know of him. And it's quite a, I should say, the nature of the event, how it was thought about, his passing in West Bengal, is certainly in light of the enormous contribution that he brought to Bengal and to Chaitanya Vaishnavism, and the outspoken nature of the Thakura and acknowledgement of his personal character. So it's good for us to hear about some of those things as well. And with regard to his appearance in the world, as you know, he was the seventh, I think, out of 12 children of Bhaktisiddhanta Thakura, who was from what's called a Kayastha family. Kayastha, this is an interesting side note, I suppose we should go into a little bit. The Kayasthas had, from the caste system at the time, had clerical type of roles in society and some government service as well. We find that much earlier also in the life of Ramananda Roy, who was a Kayastha and was a government official. So while the Gita speaks of Chatur Varnyam Maya Shrishtam, Krishna says, I created this system of 4 divisions of society. Of course, he also says, but I'm beyond it, and from within it alone, you can't know me. You have to go beyond it. That's important. But it's obvious, just a little bit of introspection, how the system, caste system, if you will, was developed, augmented as time went on to fit circumstances that were changing and just things that were undeniable. That roles were not as strictly defined by birth as it might have been thought they should be, birth being based on previous karma, so on and so forth. So sometimes, I may mention this because sometimes you hear devotees make statements like, women cannot be initiating gurus, or we've heard things like this, or women cannot do the puja to the deity, or even they say, if you are not born in the Brahmin family, you can't be a guru. Even some Gaudiya Vaishnavas make these kinds of arguments, which constitute really bhakti covered by karma. Something that is outside of the definition of Rupa Goswami's Uttam Bhakti, Jnana Karmadi Anavritam, uncovered by, not hindered, not subject to the scriptural mandates that govern Rajaguna, Karma, Sattvaguna, Gyan. It is of a nirguna nature, of a transcendental nature. And as such, because we are all of a transcendental nature, ultimately, it is for everyone. At any time, whenever you have acquired the requisite faith through good company, you can take it up in all respects. So my point is that we hear these types of arguments, even today sometimes, that ignore, in their thought to be strict adherence to Varnashram, which Bhakti transcends in the first place, they ignore how the system, like from Manusmriti on down over centuries, the whole thing has been expanded and developed, and how the scripture, in a larger sense as well, is an ongoing affair, if you will. This is a certain type of scripture that talks about Varnashram, but there are scriptures about that focus on Gyan and Bhakti and so on and so forth, but they are really ultimately an answer to the question that human life is, which is why, purpose, meaning, why we're troubled by this. Why am I? What is the meaning? What is the purpose? Other less complex forms of life are not troubled by this. And the answer to this question, of course, cannot come from nature, which doesn't have a why question. Consciousness is qualitative, so it's asking a qualitative question, and it can't get an answer from something that only deals with quantitative values. So to answer the why question, we have to turn within from where it comes and find that which we are constituted of, that's of a meaningful nature, has a source, and that source answers the question that arises, if you will, in human life, that humans are. Why? So it answers. That is what Scripture is about. My Guru Maharaj once gave the example that, the Scriptures are like the law books. So if you go to court and you say, Your Honor, I think and I really feel and I hope that you'll find my client innocent, and the other attorney says, well, I think because based on the law, it said this at this time and this year, this was decided and that, and so on and so forth, I believe he should be found guilty. Well, the latter will prevail, having cited the law. So I have to admit, when I first heard that, we thought, well, it's all there in the book. You just turn to page 108 and you'll find the answer to any questions. Great system. But if you play the analogy out, of course, laws are being determined all the time as new crimes are committed, if you will, or new questions about legality arise. You can say to kill is a crime, but what if you kill in these circumstances accidentally? So then new laws have to be made, drawing upon the legal canon to begin with. So my point only is that this revelation, even in the form of Scripture, is an ongoing affair, at least in terms of commentary and, if not, new texts altogether and so forth. And this also is an interesting point to raise in relation to the argument that the problem with religion is that it has this fixed set of answers, whereas science is an open inquiry. And if new information comes, we change. Of course, that doesn't always happen because scientific insights or facts are turned over to be applied in the real world, and economy results out of that, and a way of life, and so on. And so if facts come that contradict that, there's a tendency not to give them that much room, not to consider them perhaps as fully as they should. To shift the paradigm may take decades, if not more. But that said, my point is that properly understood, theology is that exercise within religion that is speaking and explaining the essential teachings according to, in an ongoing way, as new light arises. After all, the world is always changing. It's never the same, even for a second. So there'll always be new things to think about, how to think about them. People are changing. We are not the same as people were 100 years ago. It's funny, if I look back even at some film from the 60s, I have to chuckle what we were like, people. Yeah. So brains change, bodies change, people change. So we have to be a little flexible. And actually, spiritual people should be the most flexible, most open, most accommodating, especially in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's tradition, generous. But at any rate, aside from these points, the point I was making is that Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur was born in a Kayasta family. And the Kayastas were elevated to a Brahminical, quasi-Brahminical status. And so Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was his seventh child, and there was a anecdote that it's worth relating with regard to this son in particular. Bhaktivinoda at the time was living in Jagannath Puri, and he was a magistrate working in the British court systems, and he had a dream in which Jagannath Swami, the main deity of the Jagannath temple, appeared to him in a dream and said, I've brought you here not just to do legal work, but to teach spread the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And so Bhaktivinoda replied to Jagannath in the dream that, but I'm very old now, what can I do? Maybe you can please send me someone who will be able to help me in this. And so Jagannath Swami said to him, for that you pray to Goddess Bimala. Goddess Bimala is the principal Shakti Tattva deity within the Jagannath temple. Now Jagannath is a very, he's a flexible person. he accommodates all kinds of worship. Tantric Buddhists worship Jagannath, they have a certain idea of who he is. Shaivites worship Jagannath, they have a certain idea of who he is. He is Jagannath, after all. Nath means Lord and Jagat means the world, so he's for everybody. And he accommodates all types of religious conceptions. When Prabhupada Maharaj, who was the king, the Raj at the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, witnessed Chaitanya Mahaprabhu coming from Nadia, from Navadvip to Jagannath Puri to celebrate the Rath Yatra along with his associates. It's about a 10-hour train ride, overnight train ride. So they're walking and doing Sankirtan along the way. And from the rooftop of the temple stood the Raj with a couple of associates, and they saw the Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. They didn't, actually Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was in Puri at the time, but his associates from Bengal were coming on the pretext of celebrating Rath Yatra to meet with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And he marveled at their persona. What did he say? Chaitanya Rishishti Prem Sankirtan. Actually, he asked his, who was it? Gopinath Acharya, what kind of religion is this? And he had seen all kinds of religion. He's the Raj of Jagannath Puri, all kinds of people, they said, come and worship Jagannath with different conceptions of who he is. Even at the time and now today, the Advaitins, who have a whole different philosophical perspective than ours, they're in charge of the temple. They're the pujaris there. They run the temple. So very accommodating, Jagannath Swamis. But the Raj had never seen anything like this. Just seeing their kirtan and the ecstasy of their arrival. So he asked, what kind of religion is this? And then the reply came, this is Chaitanya Srishti. This is the Srishti, the creation of Chaitanya. It's called Prem Sankirtan. He brought this to the world. Golokera Premodham, Haridam Sankirtan. Sings. The Raj was on the edge of his seat, as you can imagine. And as it turns out, if we look through all the different religious conceptions of Jagannath, you won't find one sweeter than that which was envisioned of the Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. That's what makes Jagannath's eyes so big and always open. Jagannath looking, Krishna looking for Radha. Where is she? Having been reminded of her by overhearing others speaking about the Braj Leela and the extent to which the Vrindavan Gopikas had captured the heart of Krishna. So it's Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj compared Jagannath Puri to a train wreck. In a train wreck, well, people get banged up. Jagannath looks a little banged up. You know, his arms are stuck in, or his legs. His head's a little big. But what he meant by that was, it's a train wreck of two conceptions, the Vrindavan conception and the Dwarka conception. The latter being one of more Aishvarya, means understanding that the godhood of the Godhead of Krishna, the divinity of Krishna, and the Vrindavan conception, where they don't think of him as God and thus can associate with him more intimately. These two crashing together. This is Jagannath Puri. It's a moment. Jagannath Puri is a moment in the Dwarka Leela. When Krishna in Dwarka is remembering the Braj Leela and Radha's love. Not that he doesn't remember it all the time, but something has been said to bring it to the surface so that it cannot be contained, and it overflows and overtakes him and so forth. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu saw Jagannath playing the flute, wearing a peacock feather. He's not dressed like that, but that's how he saw him. And wonderful leelas, of course, there, centered around the Rath Yatra, primarily took place during the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But Bhaktivinoda Thakura was living there in Jagannath Puri at the time, and he prayed as per the dream to Bimala, who I said is the primary goddess of the temple. She has her own, it's a big temple complex. It's huge. There are 54 kitchens. A lot of cooking going on there. Jagannath has a big appetite. But anything that's offered him, the famous Jagannath Prasad, which people will take all over the world in a bag and distribute it to distant places and so on and so forth. It's famous for this. That prasadam is not considered Mahaprasadam after Jagannath eats it. Only after from there it's given to Bimala and she takes it. Then it's Mahaprasad. So she has a very prominent role. And depending on the religious conception that you have, then she will be thought of accordingly. So we have the Vaishnava conception of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's conception. So we see her as a manifestation of the internal potency of Krishna, who, as it came to pass, we find Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was under the influence of, and in a very prominent sense. And we'll come to that. But this is an interesting anecdote, as I say, with regard to just prior to the birth, something about the birth of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, how it came about. And of course, it said that he was born with his umbilical cord wrapped around his head, like the Brahmins, some of whom didn't like him because he was a Kayasta, wrapped around his neck like they wear it. That is a later controversy that came. We'll hopefully get to in our description of some of his exploits. Born there, and shortly after his birth, the Rath Yatra took place, and it's said that the Rath Yatra cart got stuck right there at the house. It was a rented house that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was living in, stuck and it wouldn't move. And, the garland of Jagannath fell off, and they took and gave it to the child, and then the cart went on. So these are nice stories that inspire us as followers of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. But sometimes, of course, things get exaggerated over time, and you can't verify everything, to what extent it's true, and so on and so forth. But you see the personal character and the contribution of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and it fits well with such things. They say, of course, as time goes on, they'll say, well, the miracles of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, people must have thought like that because they weren't educated. Maybe he was an epileptic, that's why he was falling into into a trance. They thought it was a trance, but of course, as I say, epilepsy is not contagious. But Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's brain was contagious. If he looked at you, he would become mad with the brain. But with regard to the campaign of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura, historical figure. I mean, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a historical figure too, but it's 500 years ago. Now we have a historical figure in the modern time in Bhakti Vinod, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, and we see in all of their lives extraordinary miracles. The miracle of my Guru Maharaj, his campaign at the behest of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura. It's plain as day, right? If you look at it, it's just a miraculous story. So miracles do happen. So the stories like this cannot always be verified in all respects. We take them seriously, given the character and the actual documented activities of Saraswati Thakura, and the result, which in a very prominent sense is ourselves. How could we deny his greatness and his contribution? We're here today because of the vision of Bhaktivinoda Thakur that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur came to give shape to, and that my Guru Maharaj then took at the order of Bhaktisiddhanta as he thought of it. It was a suggestion, actually. He wrote to his Guru Maharaj, Bhaktisiddhanta Prabhupada did. Please, Guru Maharaj, I've been a householder. I have not been able to be close to the mission and because of household responsibilities. Is there any service I can render? And Saraswati Thakur wrote to him, I think it would be good if you speak in English. Right, I think he said speak in English. So Prabhupada, my Guru Maharaj took that as, he ordered me to do this. It was like a suggestion. He ordered me. That was his like Guru Nishta. He focused on his one order and it's all his perfection, you could say, arose out of that. Such is the power of Guru Vakya. Chitete Kodiyakya. We want to make that our heart one with that, right? And a much good example. Bhaktisiddhanta, he had a little problem because he had two gurus, and one told him to do bhajan and the other told him to preach. So it's complicated as we go forward at times, but that means we have to use our intelligence to harmonize apparent contradictions that may arise. This is not for non-thinking people. Spiritual life is not for people who just want somebody to think for them. Tell them what to do. You have to think. It's important. The Guru tells us what to think, but more important, he tells us how to think. He can tell you one good thing to think about, how to think about it. If you do it right, everything will come from that. So Saraswati Thakur was born in Jagannath Puri, and in his early years, he exhibited a very high moral character, and that included a very strong religious leaning and interest, and was very intelligent young boy. And he took to accompanying his father, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, wherever he went, which involved meeting people like Rabindranath Tagore, who is a famous poet of West Bengal, who won the Nobel Prize in the early part of the 20th century. He had a famous dialogue with Einstein, if you're familiar with Rabindranath Tagore. He came once and recited poetry for Bhaktivinoda Thakur. His son was there and appreciated. These were poems about Radha and Krishna that he had written. So people like this, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was meeting through his father, and people like that were meeting him, and they noted, this is a very good son you have here, a very good character. And shortly within his studies. He was seen to have a very, very good ability to retain subjects that he had witnessed or studied or heard about, almost like a photographic memory. And he was nicknamed, I don't know how they would say it in Bengali, but living encyclopedia. So he was quite a fluent in the currents of thought at the time. And now I'm not speaking about Chaitanya Vaishnavism per se, although obviously that was his father's religion, and more, his spirituality. But these people, these sadhus, Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, even as a young boy, they were very much exposed to the world, unlike sadhus of the time. Sadhus would be not in touch with the world. You couldn't find Gaudiya sadhus living in Calcutta. You could find them in Navadvip. You could find them in Jagannath Puri. You could find them in Vrindavan. But these were all remote areas. Navadvip was such that the famous Bengal tiger was up and around. So it was a wild place. Not like the British capital, Calcutta. And Vrindavan also, very rural. Jagannath Puri maybe a little more hilltops. But anyway, these were the holy places. And they were away from the world, within the world. In Jagannath Puri, the whole economy based around the temple. Jagannath has a big appetite, he's a fancy dresser, you need everything that you need for the worldliness, Jagannath needs for his own life, right? And so everybody's employed, growing things, producing things. It's a very, very safe place, a favorable place to pursue Gaudiya Vaishnavism and be aloof from the world. During the time of the Vrindavan Goswamis, who were the founders of our Sampradaya, you may know that in Europe, there was a revolution going on. It was the heliocentric revolution, if you will. The idea, I guess it was Copernicus, the Copernican revolution, which reached the conclusion that the planets, the primary planets, and many more now that we know about, but they were revolving around the sun and not the earth. This was a sacrilegious perspective from the understanding of the Bible at the time, which is the principal form of Western revelation. So he was in risk of his head being beheaded for such blasphemy, if you will. Of course, in time they figured out, well, maybe it's not really against what the Bible says. You looked at it differently and so forth. I bring this up because, as I say, at the time, Vrindavan Goswamis were establishing Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the world. And they were either unaware or they ignored this Copernican revolution, but it was not something that was unknown in India. And there were traditionalists, if you will, who looked at the Puranas, for example, as their historical and astronomical maps and understanding of what's out there, who's asking the question that was all in their sacred texts. And while they're subject to different interpretations and so forth, the dominant interpretation did not seem to run counter to the heliocentric. Is it heliocentric? You said it a geocentric perspective, right? So some traditionalists and different schools of religious thought within India try to take on this and counter it. Some adjusted accordingly and looked at their scriptures differently and said, oh, this can be accommodated and so forth. But the Vrindavan Goswamis, they were too busy. They were, while some were busy trying to demonstrate that the planets moved around the sun rather than the earth. Well, the Vedantins in general were busy saying, well, actually beyond that, the whole world is revolving around the Atma. And then the other Vaishnava was saying, well, and the Atma is revolving around the Paramatma. And then many Krishna devotees said, well, the Paramatma is actually revolving around Krishna. And Gaudi said, Krishna is revolving around Radha. So we have a long way to go from the heliocentric perspective to the Radha-centric perspective of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas that our Goswamis were laying the seeds, the foundation for, in terms of a systematic way of teaching that. So they probably just didn't have time for that. But when it comes to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, much later, 400 and some odd years, 3/4 years later, well, the modern world was set up in Calcutta, right? There was the headquarters then of the British in that area, and they were ruling the world, so to speak. So he and his son were acquainted with, familiar with, in touch with all currents of thought in the world. I have at times described Bhaktivinoda Thakur as the first convert to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And he did have a conversion moment as he was exploring different religious traditions and systems of thought, philosophy, and so on and so forth. And the Gaudiya ideas had been obscured by misrepresentation over time, and weren't popular and weren't well understood. But he had the occasion to come in touch with, I mean, it's an amazing thing. He came in touch with the Chaitanya Charitamrita. It wasn't there. I mean, there weren't printing presses let's speak of desktop publishing or anything, making things available, no internet, so forth. But when he studied the Krishna Bhakti through the lens, the Bhagavatam, through which he grew up having an aversion to, as he admitted, through the lens of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, then he had an epiphany and a conversion. But my point is that he and his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they were very much in touch with the world. So they were in a very different position than the sadhus of the time. And then to become sadhus, as they did, they carried with them something, a plus, if you will. This plus is actually mentioned by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in his commentary on the famous Bhagavad sloka that best defines the Guru. What is that verse? Tasmat Guru Prapadyeta Jignasu Shaya Uttamam. Defines the disciple and the Guru. One has to be sufficiently eager to know. I've said, it's not that there are many problems in the world that our spiritual perspective should solve, but it should bring us to the point of understanding that the world itself is the problem and solve that. As a byproduct, other problems may be solved here or there to some extent, but the nature of the world is such that it'll never be all fixed, right? So this is the Sattvic perspective, right? So one has to be sufficiently eager to make a comprehensive solution to the problems of life. This is what the student, the spirit of the student. And then the Guru must be well versed in the scriptural canon. And Shabde Pore Tanishnatam. Shabde means this current of thought, this revelation. And that's the answer, as I said earlier, to the why that we are. And Pare means from a theistic perspective, because it can be understood from a monistic perspective, in which there's no interaction between the Godhead and the self, no love of God. So Shabde Pare, Chanishnatam, the word we're underscoring here is Nishnatam. It says he should know, she should know, the Guru, this current of thought, inside and outside, upside, downside, inside, outside. As Krishna says in the Gita at the end, one who knows, studies this inside and outside, and so on and so forth, and teaches it to the devotees is very dear to me. So Guru should be acquainted with this. And in his commentary, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, and this means not only the scripture, other books too. So in their time, analogous to Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the Goswamis of Vrindavan, who were forming the Sampradaya, they were familiar with all the currents of philosophical thought at the time. The Nyaya, Vaisheshika, the Karma Mimamsa, Yoga, Sankhya. And you can see this in their commentaries. They're drawing, these philosophers say this, they accept some part of it, reject other parts, and so forth. They were like Bhaktivinoda Thakur, like Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. They were Rup Sanatan. They were worldly people. They were ministers to the Nawab Hussain Shah, who was ruling over Bengal. So now the Goswami would be the ruler, hold the seat, hold the place of the ruler when he was out. So elevated they were. Not that they wanted to be, but it was hard to refuse Nawab in those times. And they were able to do that without compromising their spiritual interest. And indeed, we can say that it enhanced their capacity to do the service that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had planned for them. There's a plan to it all. In other words, they became diplomatic. They learned how to deal in different circles with royalty and so on and so forth. They had a worldly education as well as a spiritual education. Of course, there are internal spiritual reasons for their being the leaders, so to speak, of our Sampradaya, the founders, the exemplars, in terms of how they conducted themselves. Not every associate of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu conducted themselves in a way that we could follow their example. But the Goswamis did. Sankhya Purvakanama Ganam. They chanted a number of rounds every day. They conducted themselves as we are taught to conduct ourselves. When they wrote about that conduct, established that conduct, and so forth. But my point here is that they had the patronage of kings. When Mahaprabhu told the Sanatana, go to Vrindavan, establish the places of Krishna's Leelas and so forth, he gave them a few instructions. With regard to that instruction, they said, well, here is such and such, here is their bhava. They felt this must be the place, and we honor their bhava. So inspired by that, then kings and queens would want to build a monument there. You weren't anybody if you were a king within Hinduism and you didn't have some place in Vrindavan for your Rani, temple for her to worship Govindaji, Gopinath, Gopinath, and so forth. Land of temples, right? Probably just say 5,000 temples there. I don't know what he was referring to in particular, but there's probably 50,000. Now, unfortunately, there's probably 50 million people there too, which is good and bad. But the Goswamis were people of the world and sadhus at the same time. They were writing books, publishing texts. Nana Shastra Vichara, like Sabdharma Samastapa. Lokanam Hitakaran, out of all arising out of Lokanam Hitakaran. Hitakaran means out of compassion for the people of the world. They collected evidence from all the sacred texts and wrote what we sometimes refer to as the Bhakti Shastras. They did what Vyas did. Vyas compiled all the texts, and he wasn't satisfied. And Narada's Guru said, because you haven't fully, in no uncertain terms, emphasized bhakti. So you have to do that. Therefore, and then the Bhagavatam in its final edited form came out from the samadhi of Vyas. And this is the central book of the Goswamis, and they wrote about it, expanded upon it in their Leela Granthas and so forth and so on. And they did this out of compassion for the world. So they had some sense of delivering the world, even while their occupation was entirely otherworldly, and its attainment is rare. Manushanam sahasreshu kaschit siddhaye. What does the Bhagavatam say? Narayana. We can't remember. Similar verse. To attain and to be a Narayana Parayana, even to be a mukta is very rare. To be a muktanam apisidhanam, Narayana Parayana. Be a mukta is rare, to get out, to release from samsara. And in the context of that, to be the close Sevite of Narayan, to speak of Krishna Parayana, Radha Parayana. So it's a rare thing. Don't be discouraged. You can't be, because you've got a taste for it, and it's too far out to give up, even if it's hard, even if it takes a long time. No other, you can try, but nothing else will capture you once you've been captured by this idea, this possibility. Such penetration and insight into the nature of transcendence, the possibilities there. This has never been told before. Well, who knows if it's true? Who cares? What do you consider true? What other information we have? And the people that are giving it, what is their character? Why should we not believe them? What is their character? How are they? How does it move them? It may not move me entirely like that, but it moves them. So there's a possibility it will move me, and I need to move. I need to change. A lot. And this is such a friendly way. It's a Lila Harikatha of Krishna. There's nothing like this. Here is God in human-like form, human-like. He's completely not human and completely human. He's human-like, right? And the human likeness is such that the descriptions of God in this community are such that we can bond with him emotionally. What is a greater bond than an emotional bond? All our bonds are, that are strong are emotional. They will override logical bonds. Yes, that's right, but I feel like this. And so we'll act. Unfortunately, that's not always the best, but we're emotional beings. It's hard to imagine that a scientific description of the world that relegates emotion to a total illusion and being unreal has any value, that it would be entertained by anyone. It's a sick idea, pathetic idea. So the point is that when we hear about Krishna conducting himself, the Godhead, in ways that resonate with us, because we've had that experience. Yes, I disobeyed my parents too, and they chastised me. When we hear of his exploits as a youth, his interaction with his parents, and then in his adolescence with his lover, we resonate with. At some point in the kata, yes, everyone has an epiphany, and they bond with him. Yes, he's very charming. I know what that's like. I said before, with the Jesus of Nazareth, you can bond with, like guilt, something like that. Maybe it's a human emotion also. Oh, and there's a bonding, but I mean, this is full. This is very extraordinary. So it's difficult to disconnect, even if we get distracted, right? Unfortunately, by sadhus like Bhaktisiddhanta, Sarsvati, Thakura, there's a wide circulation of this, and out and about in the world. It should increase. And that was a kind of the desire of Bhakti Vinod, compassion for the world, being in touch with it. I'm saying it corresponds with the time of the Goswamis, as deeply as they were concerned with the other world. Without compassion, there's no rasa. And rasa retires compassion in a sense, and it retires the world for you, ultimately. Compassion, well, there's no compassion in Golok for Krishna except pathos of Vatsalya Rasa for Krishna. There's nobody to be compassionate to. Everybody's perfect. So, but for this world, to be perfect in this world is to have compassion for everyone. Universal compassion. I saw a fellow once, not a favorite philosopher of mine, who was a naturalist, and I forget his name now. I can see his face in my mind's eye, but someone was talking to him about meditation. He said, I said, what's the value of this? I mean, what do you get out of it? And to my mind came universal compassion. Is it worth anything? Does it have any value? And we have examples, some people like that. They actually feel like that. Patitanam pavanebhyo paraduki kripam buddhi. They have no suffering for themselves except what? The suffering of others. So the Dham is in a great place to be, but you can be a little aloof from the world. And by contrast, Bhaktisiddhanta Thakura was right in the middle of the world. He was in the center of the orbit of the British colonization, right, of India. And so all the philosophical currents and sensibilities, cultural sensibilities, he couldn't avoid them. He had to think about them, and then he interfaced them with Gaudiya Vaishnava, and he found Gaudiya Vaishnava has vitality in relation to all of this, all of these arguments, points of view, and so on and so forth. It has something to say that transcends all of these arguments and perspectives in terms of being a solution to the problems of the world and more. And so Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was, as his son, was following around, meeting with the different people in what was called the Bhadralok, which was a society of pious, educated Hindus that were in touch with modernity and all its, and they're reevaluating their perspectives, their teachings, their religious texts, and everything about their lives. So you have very different pair here, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur of sadhus. And given that, they were in a position to do the kind of thing that has been done by the Bhaktivinoda Paribar that has enabled us to be here today. They were, from the get-go, thinking outside of the box. They were looking at Gaudiya Vaishnavism from an essential point of view. They had to. They had to look at essentially what is it saying, rather than it says this and you should do it like this, you should do it like this, you should wear this, you shouldn't wear that. All those things have value as far as a system being set up for a spiritual tradition that defines it and assists practitioners and so forth, but it's nonetheless relative. And where it's all laid out, if you will be somewhat relative to the area, to the time, to the circumstances, and so on and so forth. And they were new times, new circumstances, in touch with the whole world, really, from Calcutta. And so they had to think about the Gaudiya Vaishnavism differently, and no one was thinking of it like that. And so when they did, when Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who was a living encyclopedia, as thought of as a young boy, he became interested in astrology. He did a translation in Bengali of the Sanskrit work Surya Siddhanta and Siddhanta Shiromani. And these were interesting later cosmographical texts that differed in some ways from the Puranic cosmographic descriptions of what's out and up there, and so forth, which brings to mind, of course, the relativity of these, for example, fifth canto descriptions of the cosmos. Worth noting. So, they understood these things. That's why Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur in his famous Bhagavad speech said, and he referred to the fifth canto, he said, and there, even in the Bhagavad, there are descriptions of hells and so forth. We don't take it, seriously. It means that there is a system in the world of reward and punishment. So he's looking, essentially what's being said here, built into the system of the world, when the Atma interacts with the world, when it takes from the world wants something back. And sometimes the rewards are good because the move was less exploitive than another, and sometimes the opposite. There's some kind of a system, punishment, reward. And you can describe it graphically like this, to hammer home the point and drive people in the right direction out of a fearful motive. There's a place for that also, if it works to a point. So he made that kind of a statement. So I'm really trying to make a point of how they were thinking differently about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, given the circumstances they were in, which we would think have been arranged. There's a background to that. I don't know any secrets about the birth of Bhaktivinoda, but I told you one about the birth of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura. They came to the world with something, with a mission that was discovered by them. They discovered that they had a mission. Like the associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu themselves, when they realized, when they had an epiphany, this boy, my Pandit, he's become a Vaishnava. He was a Pandit. He's become a Vaishnava. And he exceeds in Vaishnavism in terms of its fruits, of its ecstasy and love of God, all of us combined, they thought. He's our leader. And he's giving this out freely. Who is he? How can he give it freely? He must be an avatar. But what avatar can give Krishna prema? No avatar has prema madhurya, lila madhurya, venu madhurya, rupa madhurya. These are the four qualities of Krishna he alone has. That he has lila madhurya, sweet leelas. You can hear the leela of Varaha and Kurma. And Nrsimha's got a little sweetness in it there, but that's the point that should be emphasized. I just had some godbrothers used to want to serve Nrsimha Day, and they thought they'd be warriors. I would tell them, no, you should be like Prabhupada. That's how you follow Nrsimha. You have to become gentle like Prabhupada. But the point is, what Krishna's leelas is are very sweet, very charming. The Bhagavad captures them to some extent in the 10th canto, and it's become the most popular. That Ram Leela, some sweetness to human-like, but Krishna Leela, much sweeter still. Sweet. So anyway, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Bhaktivinoda Thakur. What's the point? How did I get there? I'm troubled by too many thoughts at the same time. Can't need more tongues, more heads. So the point is that what I was making is that they were understood these teachings in essence, and interfaced with them in light of their worldly exposure as well. And so they were, from the get-go, out of the box thinking about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, they were compelled to how to present it to the world, how to reply, to the modern perspective in ways that other sadhus weren't. They just weren't confronted like this. They were living in the Dham. So this was a setup, if I may. They were special. Bhaktisiddhanta Thakura thought, like the Thakura did about him, that his son had come from sent by God, that he had come from the other side. Oh, and my point was, this is the point, that they discovered that they had a mission. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's associates also, they thought, he must be Krishna. He's giving Krishna prema. He can't be an avatar of Krishna, because no avatar would give Krishna prema. They don't have prema madhurya. They don't have sweet leelas like this. He's giving this. So then they thought, must be Krishna. Am I crazy? He's Krishna himself? And then they thought, wait a minute, if he's Krishna, where are Krishna's associates? Because Krishna's never alone. And then they realized themselves. We are in another leela. And then it would close. And then you have epiphany. Then it would close again. Don't think the Gaur Leela is not exciting. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, in a similar way, they discovered that they had a mission. They were placed where they were for a purpose. And they used their worldly familiarity and acquaintance and so forth, and their acquaintance with Gaudiya Vaishnavas to draw from Gaudiya Vaishnava its essence and present that in any number of ways that would be more palatable to other peoples, regions of the world, dispositions, and so on and so forth. So they were very flexible. And in doing that, thinking outside of the box, they were thought to be outside of the box by many traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavas who couldn't recognize their own tradition in a new form, so to speak. This is fairly common, that in a religious tradition, a saint, a mystic who really goes to the core of what it's about, appears on the scene, and the practitioners want to crucify him. Because he's telling them things that they don't want to. I didn't think the religion was about that I had to give anything up. Don't tell me that. I told a story before that when I was younger and I was in ISKCON, International Society for Krishna Consciousness. I was in a temple in North America, and a couple who was a priest and his wife for a Presbyterian, I think it was, church, had been assigned to that church, was across the street from the temple. And so the wife would see us going back and forth to the temple and so forth, and she was interested. And so she used to come to the temple, and she would meet with me and talk, and she would come to my lectures, and then she would go home and tell her husband, he said, Swami said this, Swami said that. So he would start to factor these things into his lectures, things like renunciation, what it's really all about. The congregation was mostly older ladies and men, and they wrote to the bishop and had him transferred to the Bahamas. They didn't want to hear what it was really all about, right? They had to give up something. They had to sacrifice. That love was born from the womb of sacrifice. They didn't want to love God and get something. I love you. Now can I have something? Something like this. So these are principles, because that's the karma orientation to religion. It's not just some Indian idea. This is the basic idea. It's a childish idea of religion. I want. Okay. No. Say please. Okay. Now say thank you. Okay. Now you get it. So you're just learning some basic ideas of love. Please, thank you. A little gratitude. Learn that. We'll give you something. You think the thing is the object, but what really the object is to say please, say thank you, to learn to be a gracious person. This is the beginning of religion, karma. Gyan takes it a step further now. It's not about getting something from the world, none of which any such thing endures. And I want enduring happiness. So I should turn inward rather than outward. Know thyself. I'm more complete in myself than the world in its incompleteness, and so on and so forth. This is Gyan. From the movement of karma to the stillness of Gyan. Right? But bhakti is otherworldly. So you can't have Gyan and movement, you can't have karma and stillness. In bhakti, you can have both. You have the stillness of fixation on one person. That's love, Krishna. But love is such that it moves. It has a high tide of union and a low tide of separation. We move in the world to find love, and then we find, oh, I can rest only for a minute. To find that love has its own orbit. And now I'm then orbiting on in that circle. So as the associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu found, we are as associates, we were in Krishna Lila, Bhaktivinoda Thakur found himself, therefore, and it was appropriately so, even a religious-minded person who was a contemporary of Bhaktivinoda and a famous journalist, I think maybe Shishu Kumar Ghosh, declared he is the seventh Goswami. 6 Goswamis, they're the founding acharyas of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And he gave this epithet to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, the seventh Goswami. Meanwhile, his son was being called Siddhanta Saraswati for his knowledge in Surya Siddhanta. And we translated Siddhanta Shiromani, these astronomical books. It was quite an accomplishment. And he had a disagreement with the main teacher in the school as to the interpretation, and he wouldn't give up. He left school on account of it and so forth. He had his own thought about it, and so he was very prominent. He was given the title Siddhanta Saraswati. Then, accomplished as he was in the world, Bhaktisiddhanta in many ways, and desirable from many perspectives. People wanted him to become part of our group in this way, whether it be secular or religious or both, as they did Bhaktivinoda. Of course, Bhaktivinoda had become by this time a Gaudiya Vaishnava. They wanted his son. He had very high moral character. He started as a young lad of a society called the August Society. It was for young men to embrace a vow of celibacy for their whole life. Maybe he was the only one who, prevailed. But that's a strong vow for young, in adolescence, to make a vow, and then to stick to that his whole life. So we're talking a little bit about his character. This is what did very good come. What did Bhishma say? Bhishma?
The demigod said Bhishma.
The demigod said Bhishma. When, who was it?
When what his name was?
When the grandsire of Arjuna took a vow of celibacy, he said, "Oh, Bhishma." Whoa. How could of course he was a warrior, that's even more, but an adolescent, same thing. Wait a minute, you know what you're doing here? So of course he kept that up without any second thought, without any difficulty. But in time, he confessed, Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur, to moments of pride for his accomplishment and the fact that he was desirable by so many. And this was detected in Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who was quick to then turn his attention to Gaur Kishore Das Babaji. Now, Babaji Maharaj used to come and hear the talks sometimes of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, but he himself was illiterate. He was from a Vaishya family, I think cloth merchants. And early on in his life, his wife passed away, and he became a renunciate. And he became well known as a Siddha Purusha who had no time for anyone, practically. And he was not compassionate, but he kept to himself. And had experience of many people approaching him who were ostensibly interested in a serious spiritual life, but he could detect that they actually were driven by other motives. So he kept himself rather aloof, but he would come sometimes to the talks of Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur and the Bhagavatam. And it was to him that Bhaktivinoda turned the attention of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, suggested you should take Vaishnava Diksha from him. He had already received a Japamala from Bhaktivinoda Thakur and the blessing to chant the Mahamantra, which he did. He kept those beads his whole life. But Bhaktivinoda wanted to take Diksha, receive the Krishna mantra, not the Mahamantra, the Nam mantra, but the Diksha mantra from Gaura Babaji. So, he took up the advice of Bhaktivinoda, and very quickly, he was very perceptive. He could understand, oh, my worldly accomplishments, abilities, my intelligence, my good moral character, and all of these things, they're like counterfeit currency compared to what this illiterate person holds within his heart and what directs his movements. And I must make connection with him if I really want to attain what's worth attaining in this life. And so he made an effort to become a disciple of Gaura Babaji. And he was successful. And of course, par for the course, Gaura Babaji initiated him in an unorthodox way. Unorthodox means that at the time, the prominent Diksha gurus in Gaudiya Vaishnavism were the caste Goswamis. This is an interesting group. The original disciples of the 6 Goswamis were largely all householders. And it seems that at a certain point, they decided to change their surname to Goswami. So I can surmise, which is kind of charming. They were disciples of, like, say, Jiva Goswami. So to householder couple, they changed their surname from Patel, to Goswami. And then they passed it on like that. But of course, the title Goswami at the same time carries with it some, the meaning, it's a honorific, right? Someone has controlled their humanness. The animalness of us, if you will. As such, it pertains to a renunciate. But anyway, the idea of naming themselves Goswamis has some charm to it. But in time, it lost its charm, let's say, and in many circles, not in all, but in many circles, the caste Goswamis were giving initiation, and they weren't giving much siksha, and they didn't have much instruction to give. And from the description of the times coming through our parivar, it seems like mantras are being sold, and it was a way of having a livelihood, and so on and so forth. In fact, Bhaktisiddhanta once made a diorama where he was criticizing the Brahmins who were performing religion just to feed their bellies. And he made a diorama of a Brahmin holding the shalagram, which is a sacred stone, using it as a nutcracker. So they took him to court, the Brahmins. And there was a debate in the court, and finally the Brahmin said, well, your Gaudiyas do this too. He said, all right, we'll keep the diorama, but we'll put tilak on. Gaudiya tilak, how's that? So he wasn't shy to critique his own lineage as well. What he's saying is, how do you think the shalagram feels? You're supposed to worship him with love. You're just using him as a nutcracker just to fill your belly, that's all. This is not good. He created some enemies through that as well. But at the time, there was a system, predominantly a system for initiation, where this would be done, this would be done, this would be done, this would be done. You would have a letter. I initiated this person. This is the succession. Any number of things were part of the system, and you will wear this particular tilak because you're in this particular line. Not bad things. It's a kind of a thing that well, we need to organize this and give it some shape, some form, that people can take advantage of it, and so forth. Whereas a recluse and mystic who's kind of half off the map of the world may not be preoccupied with such details. The essence of the initiation is what? Yes, you have my blessing. Part the mantra. So people sometimes question, well, we don't know if Bhaktisiddhanta was really after the great campaign of Bhaktisiddhanta. Those enemies that he created creeped out from underneath their rocks and brought into question in the minds of the uninformed. How bona fide is he anyway? Where is his Diksha Patra, his letter that shows that Gorkashore initiated him? What tilak is he wearing? Is it from the Nityananda Paribar or the Advaita or Gadadhar? It's some generic tilak. So they put things together like this to make a case. Therefore, we say he was never initiated because obviously all these things are essential. Now, you may find that a little silly the way I'm presenting it, and it is, but it wasn't thought to be silly at the time. And this demonstrates how easy it is, unfortunately, to misconstrue details for principles and attach oneself to rules and regulations which have a place and are important, but without understanding what they're for. I'll say it once, not twice, but rules are meant to be broken, made to be broken. You're meant to break them and understand what they mean. And they no longer, and having embraced that, they no longer necessarily apply to you, other than to set an example for others, perhaps. So it's so easy to, well, he wasn't wearing, he didn't have, what tilak did he have? He didn't have any tilak. He had a saffron dress instead of a white dress. You can't go to Goloka Vrindavan in a saffron dress. You have to have a white dress. These things had currency. There are good reasons for them. There was a basis in what Swami had written, how we will dress as Gaudiyas, why we'll wear this color instead of that. There's a reason to, but it's relative also. So I often say that, well, if you want to criticize Bhaktisiddhanta for his initiation, saying it was unorthodox, you have to lay the blame on the Gorkashore, who wants to criticize him. He conducted himself in a way that people could say, oh yeah, he must be spiritual. We saw him. He begged an eggplant in the market. Then he sat under a tree, offered it to Vishnu and ate it. Offered it to Krishna and ate it raw with relish. He's not an ordinary person. And so many other things, anecdotes about it. So his life was overtly such that he would be construed to be a sadhu, whereas Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had this worldly orientation to begin with, and they were doing something with the tradition that Babaji Maharaj was not in the same way doing. He was doing it because he gave the world Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur for initiating him. But Vaishnavera Kriyamu, it's difficult to understand the activities of a Vaishnava. They may overtly look to be spiritual. They may look otherwise. What's the motive behind his or her actions? What makes their heart beat? That has to be determined. After all, Goloka is very worldly. Everyone's attached to their families, their cows, their place. They don't want to go anywhere else. Our end result doesn't look like renunciation, doesn't look like Shiva in meditation. So to move in the world, but not be of the world, Krishna Lila, as I say, it's human-like. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he took initiation from Gorakshara Babaji Maharaj. He said at the time he began to wear green-colored cloth, and he was an author, so he would write with green ink. And I don't know how he came to this conclusion, but his conclusion was that Vipralamba, which is a form of separation in Madhurya Rasa, separation between Radha and Krishna, Vipralamba, is green in color. So different emotions have different colors. Like Krishna's color is Shama, it's the color of romantic love, according to Indian aesthetics. And so just like we have hot colors, cold colors. So I've never seen it anywhere written, but this was his idea, that the color of Vipralamba was green. And he very much entered into his service to Gorakshara Babaji Maharaj and his pursuit of his ideal through a verse that he heard sung, perhaps for the first time, by Gorakshara Babaji Maharaj, a verse that was composed by Raghunath Das Goswami. It's a very extreme verse. In this verse, he says, "Who cares for Krishna? I don't like him. Even Vrindavan, I have no interest in. If," the qualifying phrase, "if I can't get the service of Radharani, these things have no meaning for me. Krishna has no meaning for me. If I can't get the service of Radha." It's a famous verse of Raghunath Das Goswami. Marsh knows it, right? So he heard Gorakshara Babaji sing this, and this verse he just focused on this one verse. He identified with that. Therefore, he described Gorakshara, Mo Gora Kishoraya, Sakshat Vairagya Murtai, Vipralambara Sambodhe Padam Bujayate. Since to Gorakshara, he uses the word Vipralamba. And he emphasized this. Of course, Vipralamba means the separation through which union will come about, which makes the heart grow fonder, which ornaments the union. So we'll pass through separation to enter into union. It's a long discourse in and of itself, the nature of Vipralamba Seva. But this was that resonated with him. He took that immediately and it came to his heart. Babaji Maharaj gave him the name is it Vrishabhanu? Vaishnavani? Varshnavana. Daityadas. So his handmaiden of Radharani. This was his ideal. The highest ideal of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, to become the handmaiden. Right. It's a very wise mathematical calculation. But if you want to please Krishna, there's this roundabout way to do that, because no one can please Krishna like Radha. So let me attach myself to being a servant of Radha. In that way, I'll please Krishna the most. It is about pleasing Krishna. It's an interesting calculation. So anyway, this is the highest ideal in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur embraced this. He conceived in himself as Nayanamani Manjari internally. An insight arrived at through Nam Kirtan. He said, Gorakshara Babaji Maharaj told him that your Swarup in the Leela will be found in the syllables of the Hare Krishna mantra. So he had a strong emphasis on Kirtan, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and the dynamic idea of Kirtan, for that matter, by which it could spread far and wide through, for example, the publication of literature. And so he incorporated these modern instruments of publishing, as you all know. He rode in a motor car. Sometimes he wore patent leather shoes, which was cool, I guess, at the time amongst the British. And there's a famous letter from a British lady who met him and wrote back to her constituents in Britain and said, and I met this sadhu, and he's different. He's different. He uses an English toilet. She didn't say it, but she meant, and he wears patent leather shoes. This is one worth listening to. So these were things, these were devices. This is ways in which he sought to integrate with other cultures in ways that would not impede, obscure his bhakti, but facilitate its dissemination. And his ideas about this were very, very radical. At one time, for example, he said, I was prepared to invite British, German, other European dignitaries for a religious discussion in Mayapur, at the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And if need be, in order to get them to come, we will serve meat. If they think, well, we're not going to go there, just to have the opportunity to share this with them. So when he heard this, Sridhar Maharaj said, he's like what? Prabhupada might have ourselves. He heard that. He didn't hear it personally, I don't think, but he heard of it. They were shocked. And Bhaktisiddhanta noticed the shock on some of his disciples, and he said, I'm prepared. What did he say? I'm prepared to go to hell or something like that, to spread Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission, to shed every ounce of blood. I mean, this was a very committed person. And he was very powerful and stout in his moral character, which was in question amongst sadhus, so-called sadhus of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, who were interested in parakiya bhav, romantic interludes with rendezvous with Krishna in the Leela, but we're having rendezvous with ladies of this world at the same time. Gaudiya Vaishnavism is very high, so there's a tendency to want to talk about the higher things, and at the cost of tending to what you need to attend to at the moment. You have good moral character, sharanagati, grow your shraddha, and so on and so forth. We have to know where to go. We have to know where we are. Focus where we are in such a way that we go where we want to go. If you want to go to India, that's fine, but you have to have a ticket. You have to have a passport. If you don't have a ticket and a passport, you don't have a job, and you want to go to India, and you say, Swami, how do I go to India? I say, get a job. What do you mean get a job? I want to go to India. Yeah, get a job. Sounds like you're giving them the wrong answer, but you have the money, then you can get a ticket, then you get a visa, a passport. If you want to grow a mango, I said, fine, come, I'll give you one. I'll give you. If you want to grow, I'll give you a tree here. The guy's eating a mango already. It's soft and delicious, sweet. I'm not giving this dried up, round, oval shaped thing. Seed. Here's your mango. What are you talking about? It's nothing. No, put it in the ground. I want to eat it. And you tell me to put it in the ground. Keep it there. Water it for years. Do the work. Then the mango will come. Then you can eat it. Right? So he was focused on that kind of instruction, if you will, with regard to how to attain the highest ideal. And appropriately so, given the climate of the times and so on and so forth. And his mission was successful, very successful. One measure of the success was that young men and women who were college educated were joining him, and they were leaving Gandhi's movement to do so. You cannot imagine how captivating was Gandhi's idea of Swaraj, liberation from the British. The whole of the youth of India was caught up in this. To draw them out from that, what power that took. Prabhupada himself confessed, he drew me away from that. Sridhar Maharaj also confessed. They were educated persons, going to the British schools and so forth. Otherwise, that was not who was coming within the fold of Gaudiya Vaishnavism amongst the young generation. They were moving in a different direction. And Bhaktisiddhanta was able to take them in the direction of Gaudiya Vaishnavism with his example and the way he spoke about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the way he applied the essence, the way he was, if you will, out of the box, and the way he exposed his representation, with the way he had no tolerance for hypocrisy, which there was a fair amount within the Gaudiya community. So this went on for years. He began initiating disciples in the presence of Gaur Kishore Das Babaji and Bhaktivinoda Thakura. A few years before each of them passed away, he initiated his first disciples in Mayapur. At that time, he changed from green cloth to white, and he was living in Mayapur, overseeing the place of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's birth, which had been envisioned by Bhaktivinoda. That's a whole long story itself. And when they passed away, he was very forlorn and a little bit lost as to how to proceed. But I made the point, he was initiating disciples in their presence. So if you want to complain about his initiating, you have to take it up with Bhaktivinoda. You have to take it up with Gaur Kishore. Don't come and praise Gaur Kishore and Bhaktivinoda and criticize Bhaktisiddhanta. That's like a half-hen philosophy. Man had a chicken, realized that this chicken lays eggs and I sell the eggs, I make money. Those eggs come out of a hole in the bottom of the chicken, but there's a hole on the top of the chicken. I have to put money in the form of food. So why should I spend the money here? I'll cut off his head. This is a half-hand philosophy. Then you have no eggs. So don't glorify Bhaktivinoda and Gaur Kishore, and at the same time criticize Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, which some people did because, again, he was pushing buttons. I was in Prabhupada's mission. I was did a lot of outreach to people and so forth, and sometimes I caused a disturbance with people. I mean, I disturbed people because they didn't want us to sell books in that place. I went there anyway, complaining, these kind of things. So some of my governors complained to Prabhupada that, sometimes he's causing disturbance. And Prabhupada said, if you don't disturb, you're not preaching. So he always protected me. I was only doing it because he wanted it. So he disturbed many people. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the Varnashram community, the Brahmin community disturbed them, many Gaudiya Vaishnavas. So after his passing, some of them, I say, came out from underneath the rocks they had hidden under in his presence when he was moving in the world and had opened 60-some monasteries in India, I think 60 or something. He had one in Burma, one in Germany, one in Britain, and he was just getting going, if you will. Huge campaign and educated people joining. Started his own monastic order, thinking outside of the box. He took sannyas, changed the color of his cloth. He took sannyas from a picture of Gaur Kishore Das Babaji. You say, well, what's that? How can he take sannyas from a picture? This guy's not bona fide. Let me tell you something about that. You don't have to ask anybody to renounce the world. You don't need permission to renounce the world. You've already been ordered to do so. You've already been told that's what you should do. You don't need anybody's permission to renounce the world. You look at the person of Bhaktisiddhanta. He was already a sannyasi in terms of what are the qualities of such a person. What is the character of the person? What's required of? He was a celibate through his whole adolescence and childhood. By this time, he was probably in his 30s. He didn't even need to, but he officially sat before the picture of Gaur Kishore and drew his blessings for that. And then he created his own sannyas mantra and gave it to his own sannyas disciples and created a monastic order of Gaudiya Vaishnavism for, like the British had missionaries going here and there. He thought, we'll send our missionaries out to their land. and so forth. And we'll dress him like this because in India, the white cloth meant most everybody wears white cloth. But the saffron cloth will stand out, so like wearing a uniform. So these were the kind of some of the out of the box type of things that he did, if you will, which were questionable from the community, but which spawned a large community today that we know, the international community of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And so we come to the end, and time of his passing. I think he left the world in Puri.
Calcutta.
It was in Calcutta.
Mhm.
They took him from, he became ill in Puri. They took him to Calcutta. And just prior to his passing, he asked that the prayer of Narottam, glorifying Rupa Manjari, which is the ideal that he followed in the Leela, be sung. He asked Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj to sing that song. And I believe it was at midnight. He left the world. Puri Goswami Maharaj said the clock stopped everywhere. We believe it. Clocks all stopped.
Morning, 5 a.m. 5.
Oh, 5 a.m. they stopped.
Yes.
Okay, maybe at midnight they sang the song. So it stopped. And then, of course, they had to take him from Calcutta to Mayapur. And this is a very touching scene because they took him by the train, and word spread throughout West Bengal that the great, he was called Siddhanta Saraswati, and Bhaktivinoda said, once he became initiated by Gaur Kishore, he said, your title, besides the name that's been given to you by Gaur Kishore, should be Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So that became his sannyas name, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So word began to ripple through Bengal like wildfire. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was the leader of the Gaudiya Math. Whether they liked him, common people I'm talking about, householders, not some religious person who had opened a temple to fill his belly and had a complaint, but general people. Whether they followed him or not, they knew this person is a serious person. This person is a sadhu of a different caliber and character altogether. And he's left the world, and they all came, one train station after another at the stops. People in throngs came to pay respect to the great Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and they didn't even know what he had done. That he would have grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All over the world, they would come to Mayapur, as I was able to do, and fulfill the prophecy of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, which said, there will come a time when people from America and Britain and other places will all come from all over the world in Mayapur and chant Jai Sachinandan, Jai Sachinandan, Jai Sachinandan. I was there for that. And the Bengali household would come out on the street, and a lady would make sweets and make an offering to the Sankirtan as we came down the streets. Offer to the kirtan, lay down. Husband standing, hands folded. And we proceeded down one street, which became known as Bhaktisiddhanta Marg, the road of Bhaktisiddhanta, chanting Jai Sachinandan, Jai Sachinandan, Jai from Europe to America, Latin America, all over the world. And this was occurring after his passing. The people didn't even know what he had done to that time was enough to bring everybody with man, woman, and child out of their home. We're reminded of Sanatana Goswami. When Sanatana Goswami left the world, he was called Munda Baba because he always shaved his head, kept his head shaved. So when Munda Baba left the world, he used to travel throughout the Braj, and people would come, villagers would come, children would come and hold his hand. And they would ask him even worldly advice, and ask him to weigh in on disputes that they were having with neighbors, and so whatever he said. He was the father of everybody in Vrindavan. When he passed from the world, every man, woman, and child shaved their head in Braj. In honor of Bhaktisiddhanta. What did Jiva Goswami say in the Sandarbhas? Sandarbha after Sandarbha after Sandarbha after Sandarbha. And I pay my respects to Rupa and Sanatana. were famous in Mathura. Not just anywhere, but as devotees in the place, in the Mathura Mangal, in Vrindavan, they were famous as devotees. These are the kind of devotees we follow. And Bhaktisiddhanta Marg is the way into Mayapur. And it came to pass in due course that the road from Delhi to branch off into Vrindavan became named Bhaktisiddhanta Marg, after my Guru Maharaj. The way to Vrindavan is through the Bhaktivinoda Parivar. You're all fortunate members of this, or well-wishers, friends of this lineage. Is very glorious. You should never think otherwise. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura, Prabhupada ki jai, Prabhupada Mahotsava ki jai, Sri Gaur Nityananda ki jai, Sri Panchatattva ki jai, Sri Radha Govinda ki jai, Radha Madan Mohan ki jai, Radha Gopinath ki jai, Sri Daji Gopal ki jai, Gaur Bhakta Brinda ki jai, Gaur Premanande, Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindhubhyeva, Patitanam Bhavane Vaishnava. Ananda Koti Vaishnava ki jai.